Well, last episode certainly got blocked worldwide, didn't it? But at least I made it available for you all to watch on my Google Drive, so that's good, I guess. So, what DVD am I gonna be looking at today? Well, let's just say that this DVD is quite not like the others I've talked about so far in this series, as it's got a different look to it. It's this one I will be looking at today, and there's quite a history behind it. Allow me to explain. Now, if you're already aware or not, the Mr. Men was quite one of the few things that I remember enjoying from my childhood. Like watching the cartoon on Planet Plantbach and reading a few other books, most of which I didn't read a lot of them until the early 2010s when I became a super fan. Plus, I've made a video 2 years ago talking about how I was a fan of the series and that I drew so many pictures when I was a kid, so feel free to check it out. However, despite the Mr. Men being the main subject of this video, there's something that's related to the DVD that was released alongside it, that being promotional DVDs from newspapers. Back in the mid-2000s, newspapers such as the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail would often give out DVDs as part of their promotional campaign. Most of the DVDs ranged from old films and shows, and particularly ones for children. My dad had somehow collected nearly all of them, and I didn't know how. The ones that I remember watching when I was a kid were Barney the Dinosaur, Kipper the Dog, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and the Island of Misfit Toys, The Wheels on the Bus, that one CGI show about some talking instruments always riding on a double-decker bus with a face, and to be honest, the animation looks cheap, and lastly, the Mr. Men. Now, there are a few others that I didn't watch but remember seeing the covers, like Super Ted, as I was more familiar watching it in Welsh, despite that I've only watched 2 episodes and nothing more, Angelina Ballerina, probably Spot and Bob the Builder, and I think those are the only covers of those DVDs I remember seeing when I was little. Anyway, I'm here to talk about this DVD here, Mr. Men and Little Miss, released by the Sunday Times. Now, if you didn't know, I was a bit anxious when I first saw it, as the DVD itself is in English and I was mostly familiar watching the 90s cartoon in Welsh, as it's my first language I've spoken. So, similar to things like Thomas and Fireman Sam, Little Me just preferred it seeing the shows in Welsh, as it's the first versions I'm more familiar with it. However, when I first saw a glimpse of a DVD, back when my family and I moved house, I saw that it didn't include episodes from the one I was familiar watching on Planet Plantbach, but something even earlier prior to that series. So, with no hesitation, I finally decided to give this DVD a go. So, here we start off with a copyright warning, then onto the logo of the Sunday Times as they made this DVD, the trademark logo featuring Mr. Happy and Little Miss Sunshine that's seen in most of the Mr. Men products, especially the books. The logo of Corian, the company who formerly owned the franchise before being sold off to Sanrio, who currently holds all the rights to the Mr. Men franchise. Then there's the logo of a communications practice, some company I don't know anything about, before finally getting into a promo.
Get your hands on one of 5 new Mr. Men books in next Saturday's Times and one of a further 5 in next weekend's Sunday Times.
Well, it's a shame I didn't get any of these books from those newspapers when they were around. But hey, at least I got to read them once when I was old, where I found them in places like in libraries, bookshops, and even charity shops. Those always have the good stuff. Also, how could I not forget the Sunday Times having the most important story on the headline where there are new laws having whistleblowers be punished? I think that wasn't what happened in real life now, was it? And we cut to the main menu, using the theme of a 1995 Mr. Men cartoon and having animations of the Mr. Men and Little Misses seen on the DVD moving around, not to mention the worm, who you didn't know is named Walter, popping in and out of a hole. And I've got to say, it looks very charming on its own, just like the other DVD menus I've covered so far in this series. Anyway, the episodes included on this DVD are from two different series, although mostly having been animated from the same studio. The first series is namely called Mr. Men, which aired around the 70s, featuring stories from the Mr. Men book series, narrated by Arthur Lowe of Dad's Army fame. And the other series is Mr. Men and Little Miss, first aired in 1983, featuring stories from the Little Miss books having narration from John Alderton and his wife Pauline Collins, whom the former you all know as the man doing the voices in classic Fireman Sam.
Oh, great fires of London.
So, without further ado, let's get straight on with the episodes, starting with Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Here we see Mr. Topsy-Turvy, a fellow Mr. Man who gets everything, topsy-turvy. His house is all jumbled up, with a front door, curtains from the windows and chimney pot being upside down. He reads a book upside down, he wears his hat upside down, and everything he does is upside down, inside out and back to front. One day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy visits a big town, where assumingly us the viewer lives, and goes off to rent a room in a hotel. And of course, with him being topsy-turvy, he speaks in a rather mixed-up way.
Afternoon, good, said Mr. Topsy-Turvy to the hotel manager. I'd room alike.
Despite the hotel manager being confused, he worked out what the muddled-up Mr. Man said and offered him a room to stay. Things went to chaos the next day when Mr. Topsy-Turvy hitched a taxi and confusing the driver on where he wants to go, causing an accident. Then, he went to a department store to buy a pair of socks, or as he calls them,
A sock of pears.
And instead of wearing them on his feet, he wears them on his hands. Because he's Mr. Topsy-Turvy. The next things he did shows him going on some more shenanigans, like walking down the up escalator, doing some very topsy-turvy things after, and hanging all of the pictures at the art gallery upside down, so he can have a better look at them. Then, just as Mr. Topsy-Turvy left town, the people are glad that the disorganized man had gone, but everything in town is still topsy-turvy, as most of the things had been turned upside down earlier by Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Now, most of the people in the town speak in a disorderly way, saying phrases the wrong way. It then ends off with a narrator encouraging the viewers to say backwards. Say something backwards. Guess I'm making the same joke as the narrator, aren't I? So, it's a very simple and charming story for a kids show, especially when it's one from the 1970s, if I might add. It's about Mr. Topsy-Turvy, a character who gets things muddled up and has a very confused vocabulary. There are also characters who have a similar trait of getting things wrong, like Mr. Muddle, Mr. Wrong, and Little Miss Contrary, and it might be stated that Mr. Topsy-Turvy is friends with them. But enough about that, let's move on to the next episode. The next episode on the DVD is Little Miss Splendid from the 1983 Little Miss series. Little Miss Splendid is known to be a splendid kind of Little Miss according to the narrator. She lives in a mansion with large gardens, a golden bathtub and dines with half-silver plates. Miss Splendid mostly thinks of herself as splendid and doesn't care about the people she sees and meets. She ignores her gardeners, her chauffeur, and even Mr. Small, calling him a common little man. While coming out to town, Little Miss Splendid arrived at a bus stop where she met Mr. Happy and Mr. Daydream. With a few introductions, Mr. Daydream asked Miss Splendid if she's going to catch a bus, to which she said that she never travelled on a bus and that she never will. Just as Miss Splendid arrived to town, she looked at the hat shop and saw that it's got the most precious looking hat she's ever seen. As she put it on, the seller demanded to her how much the hat costs, but Miss Splendid, being vain, doesn't care about prices and says to the woman to put it in her account. Little Miss Splendid bought the hat and called out a taxi to drive home, but as she was about to go in the taxi, the hat was too big for her to get in and snootily suggests the driver to have a larger taxi, as she'd rather walk on her 2 feet instead. Just as Miss Splendid walked home, things did not go out well as she thought when the weather turned rainy, causing her to get wet and even ruining her new hat. And just when things got more sorry for her, Mr. Happy and Mr. Daydream on the bus saw a wet Miss Splendid and jokingly teased her, calling it a splendid sight. When Little Miss Splendid got home, she took herself a bath and ate a boiled egg, making herself feel better. For most of the evening, she looked at herself in the mirror, admiring her appearance, still thinking of herself as splendid. It ends off with a very catchy closing song, having a saloon-esque feel to it. And that's what this story is about. Little Miss Splendid being so full of herself that she is so splendid, she thinks that she is better than everyone else. And of course, who wouldn't forget that she got her comeuppance when her new hat that she bought gets ruined by the rain. But still, she thinks highly of herself anyway, as if her lesson wasn't learned. As a kid, I already knew who Miss Splendid was, as she appeared in a few episodes of a 1995 cartoon prior, as if she was one of the central characters in the series. And there's also some trivia regarding this episode. In most DVD releases and the official Mr. Men YouTube channel, the scene where Miss Splendid disregards about costs has been strangely muted out for about 6 seconds.
But don't you want to know how much it costs? Put it on my account.
It might be because that most of the original film negatives have been lost to time and that some dialogue have been muted out, as with the case of another episode in the Little Miss series, Little Miss Bossy.
Yes, well, only if you say the magic word.
Miss Bossy thought, and thought, and thought again.
Please.
Oh, yes, that's better. Yes, well, only if you say the magic word. That's better.
But by pure coincidence, the Sunday Times DVD somehow has the original audio where you can hear what Little Miss Splendid is saying. But overall, it's a rather character-centric episode and nothing much happens in it, other than that Miss Splendid likes her appearance and all. The next episode after that is another one from the 70s series, and it's about Mr. Tickle, the character that started the whole franchise. We meet Mr. Tickle, a rather boisterous fellow with very long arms, where he can use them to grab things from far away, and you know it's obvious, tickle everyone he sees and from behind. Mr. Tickle's first victim is at a school where a boy named Peter is in class and starts to tickle him. He then goes on to tickle the teacher, making him laugh out loud and the school children laughing at him being tickled. Mr. Tickle's next victim was a policeman who is on traffic duty. And when he began tickling him, the policeman flailed his arms around, causing a massive traffic jam. He then tickled other people like a greengrocer who fell into the pile of apples. He tickled the guard who made him stop waving his flag to let the train go, apparently delaying the journey. He tickled the doctor, the butcher, and the postman, Mr. Stamp, who looked nothing like his later appearances in the Mr. Men series. At the end of the day, Mr. Tickle went home, where he had so much fun tickling everyone around town and laughed about it. And this is what it's about. Mr. Tickle tickling people from behind, accompanied with a flute playing. I know that this story may seem offensive to people in modern times, as it's got Mr. Tickle harassing some people and pretty much getting away with it. But let's be real, it was the 70s and things have been more acceptable in kids media and most people didn't mind what's suitable and what isn't. If you were to look up Mr. Tickle controversy, you're likely to see some news articles detailing how Mr. Tickle is said to be a pervert who harasses people by tickling them. Yeah, the news clearly have no standards against old kids' properties from the 60s and 70s, but the history with Mr. Tickle is quite interesting. So apparently, the author of the books, Roger Hargreaves, was asked by his son Adam, what does a tickle look like, being one of his most impossible questions. So, Roger made a sketch of a character who can tickle people with his long arms, and that character became Mr. Tickle, who appeared in his own book and later formed a series of books, selling around 100 million copies. That is how the character came to be, a little question from a boy asking his father what a tickle looks like. And despite most of the controversies this character has nowadays, it's safe to say that Mr. Tickle certainly is one of the most popular characters in children's fiction, and the cartoon is a near-perfect adaptation of it. The next episode on the DVD is about another Little Miss named Little Miss Helpful. Little Miss Helpful is said to be the most quote-unquote helpful person in Mr. Land. And by quote-unquote helpful, I mean that she fails to help people by making everything worse. One time, she tried to tie Mr. Tall's shoelaces, but ends up tying his two shoes together, causing Mr. Tall to fall over. Miss Helpful then tried to help him get up, but to no avail, and soon had an idea. She went over to the wizard's house to see him, but found that he wasn't home. She got into the house and saw a book full of magic spells, finding one of them that might get Mr. Tall back on his knees. Miss Helpful went back to Mr. Tall and brought the wizard's wand along with her and casted a spell of which she forgot to call out, making Mr. Tall shrink his legs and be the same size as Mr. Small. Miss Helpful thought that the spell worked and Mr. Tall begged her to make him tall again, but apparently couldn't remember the other half of the spell. Mr. Small showed up and that reminded Miss Helpful of the spell, but she scrambled up most of her words, apparently forgetting it. Did that really happen in the book? It's then shown that Mr. Happy is sick in bed, having the measles and not looking like his happy self. Oh dear. He is told by the doctor, who isn't Dr. Make-You-Well, to stay in bed and take some medicine 3 times a day. It wouldn't be until Little Miss Helpful came to Mr. Happy's house to help clean his house, making Mr. Happy feel much tired. Miss Helpful had cleaned the house, and when things couldn't get any bad, she tripped on a soap, got her head stuck in a bucket, got one of her saucepans stuck in her foot, and crashed into a fridge, leaving most of her food on the floor and on Miss Helpful. The noise startled Mr. Happy that he went to see what was going on and saw the mess Little Miss Helpful had made. He then tried to pull the bucket off Miss Helpful's head, and when he succeeded, he was launched out of her house, being sent flying through some objects until he splashed into a lake, having a bucket on his head. Miss Helpful then suggested Mr. Happy if he needed any help, and we know that she'll cause more trouble, just as the story ends. So yeah, this is who Little Miss Helpful is about. The name alone subverts the character as she fails to help people instead of just successfully helping them. Not to mention, there were some changes in the adaptation here that were not present in the book. For starters, the book had Miss Helpful bandaging Mr. Tall with some sticking plaster on his mouth instead of his head after he had fallen. And when she removed the plaster from Mr. Tall's mouth, he let out a scream of pain. Miss Helpful asked Mr. Tall if he needed some cream for his sore mouth, but he refused. In the animated adaptation, Miss Helpful goes to see the wizard who isn't in his house, finds his book of spells, casts a spell that makes Mr. Tall shrink, having Mr. Small show up and that Miss Helpful has forgotten the magic spell. It's just one of the cases when most of the animated adaptations of the Mr. Men and Little Misses are very different to what they have in the books. It's clear that it's got a moral, subtly stating that people may have good intentions to help, but their methods can only make things worse, and that's where this story plays out. The next episode after that is focused on yet another Mr. Man, Mr. Strong. Here we meet Mr. Strong, who is said to be the most strongest person that ever has been in Mr. Land. He can bend an iron bar with his bare hands and tie knots in it. He can throw cannonballs like tennis balls and even hammer nails into a wall by only tapping his finger. Quite the impressive feats he's got. The secret of his strength is that he eats eggs, which they make him stronger, similar to Popeye where he eats spinach to make him stronger. What's more is that every day, Mr. Strong eats a lot of eggs for breakfast, having a very healthy morning routine. But of course, his strength is not without fault as he can accidentally break things like a toothbrush, the front door, a tree and a brick wall, as he's just way too strong. However, as Mr. Strong went out on his way to the farm, he was approached by a farmer who is calling out for help as his cornfield is burning up in flames. Without hesitation, he suggested to the farmer to bring in some water and seize a nearby barn. And this just might be a perfect way on how the fire is put out. So, Mr. Strong, with immense strength, lifted the entire barn, carried it with his bare hands, and goes to a river to fill it with water to put out the fire. This just might be the best tool to distinguish the fire, especially when it's a big one. Mr. Strong puts out the fire with a water-filled barn, and the farmer kindly repays him for his heroic actions. Mr. Strong said he came to the farm to get some eggs, to which the farmer nicely offered to him. As he got home, Mr. Strong did a few spills with his strength and ate a big number of eggs for lunch, and later having ice cream for pudding. And of course, like with the stories with the Mr. Men, fairly simple and is character-centric, focusing less on the plot and more about the characters. It's about Mr. Strong and how his strength can have some ups and downs on how he handles things. And it's pretty funny considering that his redesign in the Mr. Men show made him look like a hunk, just on the name and the character alone. The episode is also one of the more famous episodes from the Mr. Men cartoon, just for how iconic Mr. Strong is. The last episode on the DVD is about Little Miss Tiny, an episode from the Little Miss series. On the little cottage of Home Farm, there lives Little Miss Tiny, in a mouse hole in a dining room. Nobody knows that she lives there, not even the farmer, who could be Farmer Fields. Miss Tiny feels so lonely as she doesn't have any friends to talk or hang out with. One day, she came out of her mouse hole to see what the outside, that is the farmyard, is like. The first thing she sees is a worm, who might be Walter, but it's likely to be him anyway, whom she mistakes him for a monster and runs away. Little Miss Tiny then meets a pig in a pigsty, and due to seeing how big the pig is from her point of view, she runs away, feeling frightened. She then stopped by a large stone after running for so long, but apparently when Miss Tiny sat on it, the stone is actually the shell of a snail, disturbing its peace. Miss Tiny ran away as fast as her feet could carry her before heading back to the pigsty, and if things wouldn't get much scarier for her, there appeared Ginger, the cat of Farmer Fields. Ginger looked deviously at Miss Tiny, implying that he's about to eat her. It looks like a Tom and Jerry scenario there. Meanwhile, Mr. Strong is on his way to the farm to buy some eggs, where funny enough, the previous episode on the DVD had him taking the main role and that his love for eggs was established. How ironic. Mr. Strong then heard Miss Tiny's squeaky voice, calling for help. He told off the nasty cat and talked with little Miss Tiny. Miss Tiny explained to Mr. Strong that she is alone and that she needs a friend to look for. Mr. Strong shows her his friends around Mr. Land to make her feel better. On the way, Miss Tiny met Mr. Funny, Mr. Greedy, and Mr. Silly. But most of all, the best friend she had ever met was Mr. Small, who said that he had never met anyone small like him, with Miss Tiny saying to him to wait until she grows up, and the both laugh, having the best time of their lives. And also, this is like what? The third episode on the DVD to have Mr. Small appearing, as 3 of these episodes are from the Little Miss series? Well, better than ever, he's one of the mains, so he's just there. So, in this episode, we see how lonely little Miss Tiny is, having no friends and nobody notices her due to her size. But when she gets saved by Mr. Strong, she thankfully goes to see some of the Mr. Men, making some new friends, especially with Mr. Small. Miss Tiny is one of the few Little Misses that we feel sorry for her, alongside Little Miss Shy, due to how lonely she was from the start. And yeah, it's easy to pinpoint the obvious recycled footage as it was very cheap back then. But overall, it's a very sweet and cute story involving Little Miss Tiny with a very wholesome ending. After that, there's a promo showing footage from both the 70s cartoon and the 1995 series of the Mr. Men, as it's later shown to be advertising the DVDs of various Mr. Men cartoons. Too bad I didn't own them, as Wales never had anything like these. And that's how the DVD ends. The whole disc had quite some very good / decent Mr. Men and Little Miss stories here and there. And I didn't know that the DVD itself was to celebrate the franchise's 35th anniversary, as seen in the back. Wow, even the Sunday Times knew how to honor the series' roots. So, out of the 6 episodes on the disc, I'd say that I prefer the Little Miss episodes more, as it's got a very synthy soundtrack, John Alderton voicing some of the male characters sounding like someone from Fireman Sam, and pretty much showing the charm of the characters. Yes, and even when I like some of the later stuff like the 1995 series due to having some zany plots, goofy voice acting and how it's nostalgic to me, and the Mr. Men show, bringing the Mr. Men and Little Misses in some comedy sketches and having some very funny interactions with each other. But all in all, this DVD was just a good way to see who the Mr. Men and Little Misses were way before the cartoon from the 90s was made. And speaking of, you know that article on the Lost Media Wiki about the Welsh dub of a Mr. Men and Little Miss cartoon? Well, if you didn't know it until now, it was created by none other than me, as I created it just so I could address the people from that wiki that a Welsh dub of a Mr. Men cartoon exists and that nobody seems to remember it. But there's this one tape I have that has the dub in it, and I don't know if others in Wales have experienced it, so maybe I could be right. But anyway, that's all I have to say about this DVD. The next episode will be about a rather silly and immature man who is seen with his own teddy bear and drives a 1977 British Leyland mini car, doing some rather inane things and causing havoc. He's one of the funniest characters on British television, and you might obviously know who I'm referring to. So see you in the next, but also I'll be working on my retrospective on the Sonic games, and I'll talk about the games that I played through most of my life. So be on the lookout for that as well.